All right, so welcome to the 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival. Our panel is entitled Richard Wright Today, a conversation with Malcolm Wright, Kimiko Hahn, and Kevin Powell. My name is Ama Codjoe, and I want to first bring your attention to the chat. There are links from the authors on the panel that you can purchase their books. I want to encourage you to support independent booksellers. So again, thanks for being here. We are going to discuss why 60 years after Richard Wright's death, his legacy is still vital and powerful. This is a panel that's being co-sponsored by the Poetry Society of America and the Center for Fiction. So it's celebrating two things. One is the recently published, restored novel, The Man Who Lived Underground. It's a novel about police brutality, racial injustice, and also the kind of realms of underworld in terms of the mind and the spirit. So we're going to talk about that. And we're also going to talk about a public art project in Brooklyn that the Poetry Society is leading. It's called Seeing Into Tomorrow, and it features haiku that Wright composed during the last 18 months of his life. So I'm going to show some images to get us started of that public art project. And hopefully you maybe have a chance, if you live in Brooklyn, to see them in person. I'm going to visually describe these for people that's useful for. So we have a green subway lamppost that's kind of framing a black background and white text. And there's a man descending the subway stairs. And the text reads, "A train crashes past, a butterfly still as stone on the humid earth." Haiku by Richard Wright. The next image I wanted to share with you, there are two parked cars on the street. There's a tree on the left with a full head of hair in terms of green leaves, and it's pointing towards text that's on a red brick background with white text. It says, "Follow wherever the tree branches make arches in the torrid sun." Haiku by Richard Wright. And the last image is on the side of a Shake Shack. It is a Brooklyn scene. Again, we have like the sidewalk with a black park bench and powder blue table and chairs and a kind of fenced-in floral garden. There's a figure looking at the text on a gray background, and the text is white and gray, and it reads, "A spring sky so clear that you feel you are seeing into tomorrow." Haiku by Richard Wright. So with that, I'm going to invite panelists to share prepared remarks, and I'm going to read your bios in the order in which you'll present. So first we'll hear from Malcolm Wright. Malcolm Wright is a filmmaker, writer, and conservationist. He is Richard Wright's grandson and wrote the afterword to the recently restored The Man Who Lived Underground. Kimiko Hahn is the author of 10 books of poems, including Foreign Bodies, Brain Fever, and Toxic Flora. Her honors include Guggenheim and NEA fellowships, the Penn Volkler Award, and the Shelley Memorial Prize. She is a distinguished professor in the MFA program in creative writing and translation at Queens College, the city of New York. And Kevin Powell is a poet, journalist, civil and human rights activist, and filmmaker. Kevin is the author of 14 books. His next two books will be a poetry collection and a biography of Tupac Shakur. Kevin lives in Brooklyn, New York. So welcome, Malcolm, and please.
So yeah, I want to tell you the story of in Berlin. I think it was maybe 20 years ago. I was walking with some friends, and up high on a building was a short poem. It wasn't a haiku. It was by someone whose name I'm going to mangle. It was Rabindranath Tagore, and he was a Bengali poet. And it was in German, but thankfully I understood enough. So, and I'm going to mangle the German language now, but it said, "Narren hasten, Klüge warten, Weise gehen in den Garten." So it's almost a haiku. It's really short. And what it means is fools rush, clever men wait, the wise ones go in the garden. And that just struck me. Like, you know, I was just walking along, minding my own business, and suddenly my world was transformed, you know, and the insight of those words, suddenly I was in the moment and I was walking in the garden, even though I was walking in a busy Berlin street. And I've retained the transformative power of big words of a poem in the street in an urban setting. So I was really enthused when I saw what you were doing. And of course, that it was my granddad's words that you were putting up, you know, absolutely amazing. So I want to dive in. I lied to you. I said I would start with The Man Who Lived Underground, but I've kind of rethought things. I want to dive into the poetry first and hopefully get to The Man Who Lived Underground. After all, this is your initiative. So, and we've talked a lot about The Man Who Lived Underground in other forums. So I'll try to get there. Okay, so I want to go through, I see a really strong, powerful common thread in the poems that you've chosen. And at some point, I'd be fascinated to hear the process of selection, but I'm going to read them and I'm going to tell you what I see. So, follow wherever the tree branches make arches in the torrid sun. So for me here, there is almost the implication of a crossing of a desert with the torrid sun. And what I'm seeing is this encouragement that Richard, who didn't believe in divine providence, but perhaps believed in natural providence, is almost telling us that, you know, if we have the courage to cross a desert in you know, seeking something better for ourselves and for others and for our communities, that something will provide. And I see this thread of hopefulness and an exhortation to step out beyond one's boundaries in all of the poems that you've selected. And I can't think of a more universal and poignant and relevant message for people right now, because the world's accelerating, and it's accelerating in scary directions, and it's confusing, and we're struggling to find our equanimity within it all, and also to imagine a better future together. You know, the more the storm rises, the harder it is to see that clear blue sky where you can see into tomorrow. And so I'll continue, and hopefully we'll see the thread getting stronger. So yeah, spring sky, so clear that you feel you're seeing into tomorrow. So, I mean, here, the ability to chart one's future is a bit of a luxury for a lot of us in the modern world, right? We feel like we're just on a treadmill, we're maintaining, we're surviving day to day. And to stop someone in their tracks within that urban environment and give them a clear picture that it is possible to see tomorrow, you know, that's the beginning of something beautiful. I hope it's an invitation. A train crashes past, a butterfly still a stone on the humid earth. Here, you know, the butterfly is this fragile, beautiful thing, and it is somehow stable whilst this much larger world crashes past. And you know, gosh, you know, if I could have the secret of how to be in that state of mind all the time, I would take it. And perhaps, you know, that's the beginning of obtaining that secret, is being reminded that you can be fragile in this world, and yet stay on an even keel. The next one: whose town did you leave? Oh, wild and droning spring rain, and where do you go? Richard's reaching down to perhaps even the most restricted level of perhaps somebody who's never left, you know, their village or their neighborhood, and he's inviting you to look beyond the horizon here again. And I hope I'll have time to tie this into The Man Who Lived Underground, because it's all apropos, it all comes together. Could this melody be sung in other countries by other birds? Again, you know, you may not have the ability to travel yet. You may not have the knowledge of what goes on elsewhere yet. But if you have that curiosity, if you're wondering, that's the beginning of the journey. And Richard is trying to make this as accessible as possible to everybody. He's saying, start that journey by wondering. what are the birds singing elsewhere? What songs can we sing together? If we look at what's being done around us, and how are we being limited by the traditions and the status quo of the surroundings we were born into. And of course, Richard's life exemplifies kind of breaking through all those barriers and just shooting out into the wider world in a way that very few people did in his time, black or white, or any ethnicity. Leaving its nest, the sparrow sinks a second, then opens its wings. So this is, of course, getting more and more explicit. And I'm just amazed at how, in just a short few words, the fear of the unknown and the heart-sinking moment of launching out into it, and then the reward close on the tails of that, is just packed in there in those few words. And what a beautiful example to set. Now, I know I'm going to be over time, so I'm just going to finish up with the last poem. The creeping shadow of a giant oak tree jumps over the wall. So here, the tree is stationary. Trees have roots. They don't get to travel unless you transplant them. And yet this tree is making a break over the wall anyway, via its shadow. And this brings us to the man who lived underground. Fred Daniels is forced into the shadowy underworld of the sewers and makes an escape. And Richard was writing this book just a few short years before he would make a break for Europe and never come back to live, so that his family could be raised in more fertile soil where they could thrive, with less racism, perhaps a different kind of racism, but one that's less immediately violent. And so you see the sinews tightening here between the poems that you've chosen and what was on his mind when he wrote that book. Do I have 30 seconds or not really? I do? Okay, all right. So I just want to say one word about the man who lived underground. I'm incredibly grateful to my mother, who initiated the project over 10 years ago to get this restored edition published, and to the Library of America, who were fantastic group of people who worked with us towards that. I just want to note that the police brutality issue, the book gives us a really broad view of police brutality, because they kill Fred Daniels, but they don't just kill him. They start the way every poisonous tree of police interactions with our community starts, with an unwarranted stop. And I want us to remember, and hopefully if we use the man who lived underground as a didactic tool, in our classrooms to talk about these issues, please emphasize this, that there is no murder, there is no torture, there is no interrogation if there is not first this unwarranted stop. And in our legal system, we have this notion, fruit of the poisonous tree. And it's a bad thing. It's not supposed to happen, and it gets cases thrown out. And yet so many of us who are incarcerated right now in the United States, all of that started from a poisonous tree that the roots of which don't get looked at, right? And so I'd like us to focus a little bit on that if we can, and just to sound a note of hope and of belief. I truly believe that we are going to fix this problem in our country. Richard Wright, when he wrote the book, the means that we have at our disposal were undreamt of at the time. We have leverage today that we didn't have. We have our cell phones, we have the internet, we have the knowledge after the protests, the recent protests, that, all ethnicities thrown together, something like 60% of the population believes in what we're trying to accomplish. There was no such certainty. In fact, there was the certainty of the opposite in the 40s. And so that brings optimism, and it brings a duty to avail ourselves of the moment. And I think we can do it. And I just want to say strategically, I'm going to be political now. I would love to see us focus on personal financial responsibility in civil cases for police officers, because there are allies in that particular road if we take it. The insurance companies want a new market. If suddenly police officers have to take liability insurance the way the rest of us mere mortals have to when we have a profession that might endanger somebody else. Even if you work behind a desk, you need that liability insurance, and you're not walking around with a gun, potentially escalating situations with citizens. You're just sitting, but you need to subscribe to that. But the police, instead, we pay for their mistakes, right? The taxpayers' money pays the reparations and restitutions to the people that they harm when they're abusive. So that needs to change. I think that people can get really galvanized behind that because of the insult added to injury that we're paying for their abuse. And I think you can find a powerful ally in the large insurance corporations who would welcome that market. And then you weaken the unions, you weaken the police unions that have this power and prestige. If we are able to accomplish that, the police will look at their unions and say, you didn't protect us from this. And that political stranglehold will be weakened as well. So that's me. I'm sorry if I overran. I love you all. Thank you so much for having me. And I can't wait to hear from my fellow co-panelists.
I think I'm up. What an honor and a pleasure being invited to speak and honor Richard Wright's work, and with this panel, and for the Brooklyn Book Festival. So thank you all, and thank you, Ama, for leading the way here. I was thinking about when I first encountered Richard Wright's work. Of course, I hope for all of us that I've known him for decades as a prose writer. I recently reread Black Boy, which is a 1945 memoir, and was struck again with reading about his upbringing in Mississippi, Arkansas, onto Chicago, and his involvement in the Communist Party. I felt very much a comrade as I was reading those passages and scenes. So it was very interesting, and the complexity of that time and of politics, especially rereading it in the wake of the Black Lives Movement, was particularly eye-opening, and it was newly different. And reading it was newly different and differently terrifying. It was newly and differently terrifying to read his memoir. I can't recall when I first discovered that he had this amazing volume, excuse me, of haiku. And I'm going to talk about it in a minute, in a second, but I first want to confess my attitude toward haiku. My academic background is actually Japanese literature. And for a long time, I actually didn't care for the form. It just, I think because haiku written in the West is so, there's kind of an obvious quality, and not obvious in a Zen manner. Kind of liquid, watered down. But when I did read Richard Wright's haiku, I felt I was reading the best haiku written in the West. Now, I haven't read all of it, obviously, but I was just so struck, and I really felt that I was discovering the haiku and what I loved about the haiku again, having read some of it in Japanese way back decades ago when I could do that. Reading, and this is like, I think one of the many copies I have because I keep lending them out. The collections forward and afterward are excellent. When I read them, when I read this collection and the writing, the essays, I don't think I'd ever learned so much about haiku as I did with the essays by Hakutani and Tenor. And so I was struck both in a way
academically
or just information wise, but also the way, and again, Richard Wright chose to use the strict 17 syllables, because a haiku, strictly speaking, is 575 syllables. Not everyone writing in a language that isn't Japanese, like English, not everyone adheres to the 17 syllables, but he did. More important than the syllabics is honoring the feeling and the sense of haiku. And what I love and adore about his and about this collection is that not only did I learn that it became a practice for him, like a spiritual practice, I guess one could say, but it also gave him a kind of philosophical channel, portal, a poetics that was just absolutely stunning. He also mostly, not always, adhered to using a nature image, which especially in modern haiku, contemporary haiku, is not necessary, but that traditionally, that's what one uses. I also found in his haiku his ethical nature, his belief in justice, his perseverance, and I was moved and inspired by finding that, which of course I knew about in his prose, but finding that in his haiku, I literally inspired. As Malcolm mentioned, he wrote these in the last about year, maybe a little less, of his life. He was in exile. He was an aging man and very ill. I'm 65. I find his writing and his changing and finding this writing practice immensely inspiring and a model for change and resolve. I want to read, let me see, I think I have time to read maybe one or two haiku and just talk about what I love about them. This is number 812, if you have the book. Heading toward the sea, drifting into the cold rain. How strong the smoke is. What I love about this haiku is I'm not exactly sure what the point of view is. Perhaps first person, I'm heading, although he doesn't say that. Heading gives a sense of direction and purpose, a seascape, and then drifting undercuts that kind of heading, right? It's sort of, we're moving in one direction, but then the idea of drifting. He adds the weather, and at the end, we do get an exclamation, which also adds to the sense of first person point of view. So he's doing all of this in 17 syllables and engaging what is essential about really good haiku, and that is moment of awareness and quiet. I'll end with that. And please, everyone, enjoy the haiku on the website, PSA website. And if you can't make it to Brooklyn, but please come to Brooklyn and take a walk, take a hike, a good one. Thank you.
Kevin, you're muted.
Wow, I forgot I was muted. Sorry. I was saying I want to thank you all, Ama, Kimiko, Malcolm, Brooklyn Book Festival, Center for Fiction, and Poetry Society of America for this opportunity. I don't take them for granted. Malcolm, it's good to see you again. We've been talking about your grandfather a lot the last year or so. Very heavy conversations, beautiful conversations. I want to start with the word love, because I think that a lot of writers, we throw the word around, but Richard Wright was actually the first Black writer I ever fell in love with, and I remain in love with them because of the wonderful post-civil rights education that I got here in America. I did not know that Black people or Latinx people or Asian people or Native American people or women or folks who were disabled or short-statured or who happened to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender were writers or could be writers, because I didn't get any of that in my education K through 12. In spite of finishing second in my grade school graduating class and winning a couple of awards and finishing third in my high school graduating class, I was given white writers, white male writers, straight white male writers specifically. I'm a first generation college student, and my mother has 8th grade education. She's from the very South that Richard Wright talks about in Black Boy. I get to Rutgers University only because of a program that was created during the Civil Rights Movement, the movement that Mr. Wright didn't get to see himself, that he prophesied through his work, his entire life. And when I got to Rutgers, there was 2 books that I read, Autobiography of Malcolm X and Richard Wright's Black Boy. Black Boy spoke to me especially because I had wanted to be a writer since I was a child. I love literature. I read everything. My mother took me to the library when I was 8 years old, and I have been a book person ever since. I can't imagine a day going by where I don't read. But I had never heard of Richard Wright. I didn't know he existed. And I read Black Boy, and it was the first time that I read something that spoke directly to me, ever. And it's the tragedy of the educational system in America and really around the world is that it's educational malpractice if you don't include literature of all the people who exist on this planet. It's pretty basic to me. I was blown away by his honesty, and Richard Wright's Black Boy and his subsequent work, because I ended up reading everything I could on Richard Wright or by Richard Wright, actually gave vocabulary, language to what I had been feeling my entire life up until that point. Things that we talk about now, like white supremacy, like trauma. I didn't know what those words were. We didn't know what those words were. He articulated for me. He helped me to understand my mother. It was beginning me understanding my mother and her pain, her rage. It helped me to understand all the violence around me. It helped me to understand my own traumas that I was carrying around into my adult life. It made me understand what oppression is, And so I think that it's important for us to constantly revisit Richard Wright. And I'm glad that we are, because I think, Brother Malcolm, as George Orwell said, everything is political. It's a lie. I think people would agree here to say that some things are political, some things are not. Everything's political. Everything's political. The fact that I didn't know who Richard Wright was the first 18 years of my life was a political decision by people who run schools in this country, private schools or public schools. It doesn't matter, And so that changed my life, but I didn't stop there. I read Native Son. I read, Uncle Tom's Children. I read everything I could get my hands on. In fact, as I was getting ready for this session with you all, I've been writing haikus for 30 years. And I realized I started writing haikus because of Richard Wright, because I discovered that in the last year and a half of his life, he wrote 4,000 haikus, 817 of which are collected in that book that Sister Hahn just held up, And I believe that when we talk about Richard Wright and haikus, think about what was happening in his life. And we can't separate Richard from the political realities. I mean, the man who lived underground, and Malcolm and I, as we said, we talked about it in different panels, but the book is about police brutality. This is written in the 1940s, it's 2021. And, what was striking to me, Kimiko, when you said that he was an aging man, Richard Wright was actually only 52 years old when he died. He's the same age. He would be in my generation. I'm in my 50s. He's the same age that people like Michael K. Williams, who just died, Biz Markie, who just died, DMX, who just died. And when you said that, the thing that's been on my mind a lot leading into this conversation, because Richard Wright is that important to me, is why do Black people, especially Black men, die so young, especially the Black men who have the courage of a Richard Wright and speak their minds, in a way that is very unapologetic. People tend to focus on Black Boy, Native Son, Uncle Tom's Children, the early stuff. We know that, and Malcolm, you may remember, there was a panel we did recently where the moderators tried to suggest there was no efforts to suppress Richard Wright, which is an outright lie, which is a complete lie. Because if you happen to be political in America as a Black person or a brown person or a yellow person or a red person or a queer person, any group that's been, or a woman, anyone who's been marginalized, and you speak out very forcefully to Richard Wright through his literature, you're going to be considered a problem. I mean, we need to understand that when the FBI was formulating in 1919, it was also the year that the Harlem Renaissance exploded. And many of the Black writers of the Harlem Renaissance, including Zora Hurston, Langston Hughes, and Claude McKay, were all under FBI surveillance. Well, guess what? Richard Wright was under FBI and CIA surveillance. We need to be clear about that. And so when I think about Richard Wright and his haikus, the last year and a half of his life, I believe, for my readings of those poems, is that he was looking for peace any way he could. I think he was very lonely, except for his incredible wife and his family. But I think he was trying to find peace. I mean, it's no different than me getting on a plane tomorrow, or constantly, I should say, and going to California, because I need nature, just like Richard Wright needed nature, in those poems that we're talking about, because it is very difficult to be a person who's been marginalized, to be a writer, be an artist in a society that says it's about freedom, but doesn't really believe in freedom at all, And so when I think about Richard Wright, I think about his voice as an activist and as a writer. I don't think it's a coincidence that in 1955, he went to the Bandung Conference. Kimiko, you were talking about it, but here's someone who grew up in America where he was basically bombarded with Blackness and whiteness. But when he went to France, he became an internationalist. And he understood, wait a minute, I need to pay attention to what's happening in Africa. I need to be paying attention to what's happening in Asia. Who are these other people who are coming together to talk about colonialism and racialism, or what we call racism, white supremacy? Well, that was the Bandung Conference. And so I say to people, not only pick up the haiku collection of his, the 817 haikus that he wrote, but pick up a book he wrote about the Bandung Conference called The Color Curtain. It's a very, very important read. He's reporting as a journalist about why are these people from these Asian and African countries coming together to challenge colonialism, because he realizes, just like he was dealing with horrific racism in America, not just in the South, but also in Chicago and Memphis and New York. And he lived in Brooklyn, not far from where I live right now here in Brooklyn. But also, wait a minute, what are these folks who call themselves Indonesian, Japanese, Chinese, Ghanaian, South African, what are they dealing with as well? And so I think that for me, Richard Wright was a door opener into my, what we call now, wokeness, because I was like, I can't just be a writer. I have to be an activist as well. And this is important to say, because I think, yeah, do we want to sell books? Absolutely. Do we love our fellowships and writer colonies and all those things that we get? I just got a nice grant recently that's coming in. That's great. But at the end of the day, I feel more than ever, especially having made it to my 50s. I used to think that Richard Wright I thought 52 was way off. Now that I'm here, I'm just hoping I make it to the next year, because I know what it means to be a political person who happens to be a writer, who happens to be an artist, especially if you happen to be a Black person. And I don't get into that Black men and Black women who has it worse. We just have it differently. And I know the kind of threat specifically that Black men like a Richard Wright represented. Richard Wright was Malcolm X on paper. That's what he was. He was Malcolm X on paper. He was speaking the same kind of truth to power fearlessly that Malcolm X would be doing as their lives overlapped into the late 1950s. And Malcolm obviously outlived him by about 5 years. I also need to say this, and I'll close here. It's important to look at what happened in this lifetime. And then this is really for all writers. I think about this a lot, and I think about this more than ever, because we're losing so many people who are brilliant artists, including writers. That love piece is important. I look at what James Baldwin did as a young writer when he basically trashed Richard Wright. And I love Baldwin. He's the greatest influence on me as an essayist of any writer who's ever lived, period. But I think about a lot now how we relate to each other as writers, as creative people, as artists, who talks to each other, who doesn't talk to each other, the grudges that people hold, the unresolved things. And I just, especially with COVID happening and this global pandemic, I think about how hurt Richard was by what Baldwin said about him as he was trying to help Baldwin. It doesn't mean he was above criticism. But, I just need to say this, whether it's straight folks and queer folks, women and men, whatever your identities are, fighting each other, especially people of color, not speaking to each other, avoiding each other, holding on to stuff until people are dead and gone, that has nothing to do with art or humanity to me. That's how I feel at 55 years of age now, and being lucky that I've made it this far. You know what I mean? And I feel like part of my responsibility to honor Richard Wright is to just keep telling the truth and okay, Wright led me to a certain point, which is here's the context of what we've had to deal with. Here's the trauma. The question becomes, where do we go from here, as Dr. King said? And I think about that a lot. And I think about the price that we pay as writers, as artists. And so, I think we need all kinds of writers. I support all kinds of writers. I believe in all kinds of writers. But I also know that we need to be conscious of the fact that if you're a writer like Richard Wright, who has the courage to say, I'm anti-white supremacy, I'm anti-patriarchy, I'm anti any systems of oppression, you're going to pay a terrible price for it. And I believe that the only reason why we're embracing Richard Wright now, not us here, because we love Richard Wright, but some people are embracing Richard Wright is because he's been dead for 60 years. You know what I mean? And even that is intentional. And we need to be very clear about that. That's intentional. And so I just need to say that. And I also know that it's very odd to me that someone who was a writer the way he was surveilled so heavily by the FBI and the CIA. What did he represent that made people feel like he had to be stopped or even monitored like that? What did Richard Wright represent? And so, my encouragement to writers, if you really love Richard Wright, then we need more writers who are going to be fearless and tell the truth, and not just, as Toni Morrison said, and I'll stop here, for the white gaze, for the white gaze, for the white gaze, but because you really believe in justice, as Richard Wright did for all people. That's what I think about.
Thank you. Thank you each. I feel very fed by what you prepared to share and excited about the last part of this panel where we get to keep talking. So thanks again. I think I'll start with this idea of nature poetry as apolitical, and this kind of generic idea of what nature poetry or haiku might be, and how we hold both the prose and the poetry of Wright and that kind of range. What does that tell us, or what does that demonstrate to us as readers, as writers, as lovers of freedom? What can we learn from that big breadth of his work? And some of you touched on that briefly, but I would love to hear if anybody had anything more to say about holding that. Kimiko.
Yeah, I have two things, if I can hold them both in my head. One is I learned very quickly in my early years as a writer that I didn't have to, the contents, the subject matter of my work didn't need to be quote unquote political in order for me to be a political poet or to participate in political events and actions. I could go to an event, say a benefit for homeless people, and if I read a love poem, that's political. And that's what Richard Wright does with his haiku. You can write whatever you want, right? And it's how you use it, it's who you are, and that is super powerful. Increasingly, I see people of color taking the ecology into account and seeing how pollution and climate change impacts their neighborhood in very real ways. So nature, I mean, it's all political, as has been said a number of times and in different ways this past hour.
Yeah, Malcolm, thank you.
I remember to unmute myself. I'm so proud. Listen, this is something that I wanted to touch upon. I'm so glad that you mentioned it. So one of the ways in which Richard Wright, back when he started writing haiku, which is sort of, I think there had been some forays in the West into haikus already, but it was early days in that sense. He immediately, and I would say instinctively, and he probably could not have done otherwise, transgressed one of the sort of traditional takes on haiku from the old Japan, which was that you did not insert yourself into the tableau that you're painting with your haiku. The tableau exists beyond the observer. And so there's this incredibly modern sensitivity that Richard injected, and which is now commonplace. Lots of people write haiku in which, right? And it's a political statement. It's political. It's there's philosophical and scientific ramifications. I mean, what we learned in quantum physics during the decades that would follow show that there is no separation between the observer and the observed. All of that's acknowledged in placing oneself within the scene, and you cannot be political without affirming how the world affects you and how you affect the world. And so I celebrate that in what Richard did. And my favorite of his haikus, and I think you were going to ask us which was our favorite at some point. Listen, I'm terribly unoriginal. This is everybody's favorite, or a lot of people's favorite. And I don't want to get a single word wrong, so I'm going to bring it up here. Actually, maybe I may have to say it from memory. I am nobody. A red sinking autumn sun took my name away. So there he is. It's the first thing, but he's negating himself. So it's almost as if he's come full circle. He worked through being in the scene, being an active participant, being a political entity with interests and needs and agency. And at the end of the road is ego death and a type of, transcending. And to go back to the police, I would wish this upon every human being, but especially police officers. Experience ego death, and you will experience your job differently. You're here to serve. And, that Richard Wright, ironically, really was somebody, and we all are somebody, but we're also nobody, and we're all here to serve. And I wish that would be taken on board more broadly and specifically by our police officers.
Thank you. I'm gonna move to another question. So it's interesting, Malcolm, because you brought up hope earlier, and I think there's something that when you read about the biography of Richard Wright, you learn about a lot of intervention in the white literary establishment and editing. And a lot of that could be summarized as just like, we want more hope. We want your ending to be more hopeful. So I'm wondering what Wright teaches us about hope and how that might be troubled or complicated. For me, like, I'm thinking about just how staring into the stark reality or the tragedy or the terror is actually an act of hope. And feels like an act of survival, like a necessary act. But I just wondered if other people had ideas about hope, hopefulness, and Wright's work.
I mean, I have eternal hope because of Richard Wright. He told me I could be a writer. I mean, it's simple. We need to see models that exist that look like us, and that did it for me. That was between his Black Boy and Malcolm's autobiography. It changed my life forever. You know, Richard Wright represented freedom, and you were talking about the nature of poetry a moment ago. I feel like his whole life was a continuous search for freedom. And I don't even know if he would have been able to write those 4,000 haikus in a year and a half if he hadn't left the United States, where he felt he was not free completely. You know, he needed the space. And then he was introduced to things like that great Japanese form. I mean, if you look at a haiku, it feels like in a misty rain, a butterfly is riding the tail of a cow. I mean, you know, the assumption is that Black writers or Asian writers or Latin American, Latinx writers, whatever writers we are or whatever we identify as, like to Kimiko's point, which I loved, is that everything we have to write has to be overtly political. Absolutely not. I mean, a lot of stuff I write is about nature, just like Richard Wright. In a misty rain, a butterfly is riding the tail of a cow. That's a haiku by someone, Richard Wright, who has an incredible imagination, who came from the South, who saw nature, who's around animals, who's around insects, you know, but somewhere along his journey, you know, as a writer, starting specifically in the 30s, you know, he had to take on that persona of this political writer because he had an incredible voice. But I'm sure that he was coming back to where he started when he was writing those haikus. And I just think that, you know, something you said, Malcolm, early stuck with me is your quote, seek something better for ourselves and our communities. And so to your question, Ama, I feel like that's Richard Wright's entire life. He was trying to seek something better for ourselves and our communities, and it came through his literature.
So you really nailed it, and Kevin, I'll come back to something you said as well, if my brain doesn't fail me. But yes, so the hopefulness of facing reality, and when the going gets rough, that's where it becomes harder to do and vital to do so. So imagine a ship that's sinking. You know, that's when people get mutinous. That's when, you know, everybody's divisions flare up, and you know, everyone starts acting selfishly instead of as a team to maybe right the ship and not sink before you reach land. And this is a metaphor that could go on and be rehashed in 1,000 ways. It is so true. It applies to almost every situation. Whenever the going gets tougher, it'll be harder to hold things together, and yet that's when it's vital to do so. And if we can't face our trauma and go down into the sewers like Daniel did after his trauma, and put our hands on the clay of the human condition by doing so, then we're skidding away from reality. And you know, lose their minds in the downfalls of civilizations. You know, it's a very powerful time in history when a civilization falls. People literally don't know how to cope. We become like ants, where the anthill has been stirred up, and you know, maybe the queen has died, or the eggs have been spread in the wind, and they don't know what to do. You'll see them go around in circles, and we are not immune to that effect, and it starts to happen gradually as things start to become undone. It's not an inevitability. I think that we need to age and mature gracefully as a society. We may never be the way we were post World War II as a nation, but who cares, right? Like, I'm not 20 years old anymore, and I'm happier than I've ever been. You know, I can't run 10 miles the way I used to. So what? You know, the point is to do this gracefully by keeping it real, right? And the people who die young and go out in a blaze of glory is because they're not willing to face the reality of those later steps of life that you need to evolve through. And I think our society as a whole has a similar problem. And the hopefulness that I have is that there are writers and they have audiences who are keeping it real and following this process of, you know, I would say graceful aging, right? Let's move on to the next age of America, and it doesn't have to be great the way it was, you know, to just get rid of those delusions. And that's the danger, of course, of these neo-fascist movements and their allure. Is we have such a track record in our nation of being absolutely wed to an unmoving ideal of who we are. We are the good guys. We are the bringers of democracy. We are, shelter, embrace the huddled masses, et cetera, et cetera. But the dissonance with who we think we are and who we've actually been up until this point is what will break us apart. And if we continue to allow that divergence to increase as the going gets rough, our fate is written if we do that. So that's my hope. And I'm so glad you articulated it that way and that we're able to talk about it today in this panel.
Thank you. So, that was such a good conversation. I feel really honored to have shared space with you each. So thank you, Malcolm Wright, Kimiko Hahn, and Kevin Powell for being with us. I just want to remind people there are links for books to purchase. And if you would like to make a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, please do. It is the 16th year of the festival, which offers free literary programming for all. So have a great night and thank you very much. Bye.